When your prayers seem empty, God's love finds you in the silence. There are moments when your prayer breaks, but heaven stays silent. You cry, but nothing changes. You speak to God, yet all you hear is the echo of your own voice. And somewhere inside, a question begins to rise. God, are you still here? If your heart has ever whispered this question in the dark, this message is for you. Breathe slowly. Let your soul exhale. You are safe here. Because it's in the silence, yes, right there where you feel abandoned, that God is closest. Not speaking, but shaping. Not absent, but working. And today, you will understand what heaven is doing in the quiet that has been breaking your heart. When the silence feels heavy. There are seasons when prayer feels heavy, like every word leaves your lips only to fall at your feet. You close your eyes, you bow your head, you open your heart, but the silence becomes louder than your faith. Have you felt this? That painful emptiness where you pray, and nothing happens? You speak to God, but the only answer you hear is the sound of your own breathing. You try again the next day, and the next, and the next. Yet heaven still feels distant, and your soul begins to wonder if something is wrong with you. People around you might say, just have faith, as if faith were a switch you can flip at will. But they don't see the weight you carry. They don't feel the ache in your chest when you kneel to pray. They don't know how many times you've whispered, Lord, I can't carry this much longer. You wipe your tears, you stand up, and you keep moving through life with a quiet storm inside you. You laugh when expected, you smile to avoid questions, but deep inside a silent cry sits in your soul. How many times have you asked God, why won't you answer me? How many times have you wondered if your prayers were too small, too weak, too imperfect to reach his heart? You start revisiting your past, searching for reasons, wondering where you went wrong. But God is not silent because he's angry with you. He is not distant because you failed. His silence is not punishment. And yet, the enemy wants to convince you otherwise. He whispers lies into your exhaustion. God doesn't care. God forgot you. Your prayer doesn't matter. And slowly your heart begins to believe the noise of darkness instead of the truth of heaven. But let me ask you something. Is silence always the absence of God? Or could it be the place where he is working the deepest? Think about a seed. When it is planted, it is covered, unseen, buried in darkness. No sound, no movement, no proof of life. But under the surface, a miracle is forming. Roots are growing where no eye can see. Strength is being built in secret. And only after this silent work is complete does life break through the ground. Could it be that your soul is in that same hidden place? Maybe God is building roots in you, roots of endurance, roots of trust, roots of unshakable faith. Maybe his silence is not rejection but protection. Maybe he is preparing something in you that requires the quiet. I know the silence hurts. I know the waiting feels cruel. I know your heart is tired. But heaven has not stopped moving. God is not ignoring your voice. And this silence you fear so much might be the very ground where your breakthrough is being formed. When faith begins to tremble, there comes a point in the silence where something inside you begins to tremble. Not your body, but your faith. You still believe in God. You still honor his name. You still know he is powerful. But your faith no longer stands tall like it once did. Instead, it shakes. It flickers. It bends under the weight of unanswered prayers. Have you felt this trembling? That place where you still believe, but you're tired of believing alone in the dark? You wake up and move through life doing what needs to be done, but your soul is running on fumes. You pray, but the words don't flow like before. Sometimes you just sit there, with no words left at all. You hope God can hear what you can't even say anymore. You're afraid to stop praying, but you're also afraid to expect anything because expectation keeps hurting you. And so your faith stands there, alive, but shaking. And maybe you've wondered, Is God disappointed in me because I'm struggling to believe? The answer is no. God is not threatened by your trembling faith. He is not offended by your tears or your questions. He is not shocked by your weakness. He sees the battle inside you, and he has compassion for you. But let me ask you something. What if this trembling is not the end of your faith, but the beginning of a deeper one? Faith that has never trembled is faith that has never been tested. And faith that has never been tested is faith that has never grown. Sometimes God allows you to reach the end of yourself, not to break you, but to rebuild you, not to shame you, but to strengthen you, not to silence your faith, but to purify it. Have you noticed how easy it is to believe when everything is going right? When prayers are answered quickly, when doors open, when miracles are visible, faith feels effortless. But what about when heaven is silent? What about when nothing moves? What about when all you have is a whisper of hope in a tired heart? That is where real faith is forged. Not in sunlight, but in shadow. Not on mountaintops, but in valleys. The enemy wants to use the silence to convince you that you're losing your faith. But God wants to use the silence to reveal that your faith is real. Even trembling faith is still faith. Even tired faith is still faith. Even questioning faith is still faith. If your faith were dead, you wouldn't be wrestling. The very fact that you are still praying, still seeking, still knocking, even with tears in your eyes, is proof that your faith is alive. So let me ask you, how many times in your life has God brought you through something you thought you wouldn't survive? How many storms have you walked through already? Did God abandon you then? Or did he carry you in ways you only understood later? If he was faithful before, why would he abandon you now? This trembling you feel is not weakness. It is transformation. You are being stretched, not destroyed. You are being refined, not rejected. Faith is not the absence of trembling. Faith is choosing God despite the trembling. And if all you have left is a broken "Lord, help me," heaven counts that as faith too. You are not failing. You are growing, and you don't even see it yet. The silence that shapes the soul. There comes a moment in every journey of faith when God stops answering the way he used to. Not because he has changed, but because you are changing. The silence that once felt cruel begins to reveal its purpose, though slowly, very slowly. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, what kind of person am I becoming in this silence? Not what I am losing, not what I am waiting for, but who I am becoming. Silence has a way of exposing what noise keeps hidden. In the absence of immediate answers, your heart is forced to meet itself. You begin to see your fears, your dependence on control, your impatience, your wounds, your need for reassurance. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? Because silence confronts us with truths we prefer to ignore. Yet God sees all of this, and rather than turning away, he chooses the silence as a tool to heal, shape, and refine. Think for a moment. If God answered instantly every time you prayed, would your faith grow, or would it become dependent on constant proof? If every prayer came with immediate clarity, would you learn to trust, or would you only follow God when he explained himself? You say you want a deep faith, but deep faith is not built in ease. Deep faith is built when your heart has every reason to run and still chooses to stay. So let me ask you with love, are you staying, even in the silence? Silence teaches a faith that noise never could. Silence teaches you to walk, not be carried. Silence teaches you to cling to God's character, not his signs. Silence teaches you to believe that his heart is good, even when his voice is quiet. This is the soil where unshakable believers are formed, roots going down before the fruit ever appears. You may not realize it, but something sacred is happening inside you. You are learning to stand. You are learning to endure. You are learning to wait without giving up on God. That is strength. That is spiritual maturity. That is love. Because if your love for God can only survive when he speaks, then it is a shallow love. But if it survives when he is silent, then it is real. Have you ever considered that maybe God is trusting you in this moment? that maybe he sees something in you that you cannot see in yourself. The same God who walked with Joseph in prison, with Elijah in the wilderness, with David in the caves, with Jesus in Gethsemane, walks with you now. And in every one of those stories, silence was part of the process. Delay was part of the story. Hiddenness was part of the preparation. So before you call this silence a punishment, ask yourself, what if this silence is actually promotion? What if this is where God is making you stronger than you've ever been? What if the version of you God is building in the quiet is the very reason he cannot answer loudly yet? You are not being ignored. You are being shaped. And soon, what God has been forming in you will be seen, not just by you, but by everyone who once doubted that anything sacred was happening in the silence. The waiting that transforms the heart. Waiting is one of the hardest places for the soul to stand, not because waiting itself is painful, but because of what waiting confronts inside of us: the lack of control, the unanswered questions, the fear that maybe nothing will change. When God asks you to wait, he is not just delaying an answer. He is developing a believer. Have you noticed that waiting exposes what is hidden in your heart? The impatience, the insecurity, the fear of abandonment, the desire to hold the pen and write your own ending. Waiting with God is not passive. It is not empty. It is not pointless. Waiting is work, spiritual work. It is the place where the heart is stretched, where faith is purified, where motives are revealed. Let me ask you something. Who are you becoming while you wait? Are you becoming bitter or better? Are you becoming anxious or anchored? Are you becoming someone who complains, or someone who trusts, even with tears in your voice? God often allows waiting because the answer is not ready, or you are not ready. Sometimes the blessing is prepared, but the heart is not mature enough to carry it. Other times the heart is ready, but the circumstances are not aligned yet. Either way, God sees the full picture. You see the moment. He sees eternity. You see delay. He sees development. You see silence. He sees transformation. Think of the great stories of faith. Abraham waited decades for a promise. Joseph waited years in slavery and prison for his purpose to unfold. David waited in caves after being anointed king. Even Jesus waited in hiddenness before his ministry began. If waiting were a sign that God has abandoned you, then every hero of faith would have been abandoned. But waiting is not abandonment. It is preparation in disguise. And here is something you may not have realized. Waiting reveals what you love most. If what you are praying for becomes more important than the one you are praying to, God will wait, because he loves your heart more than your outcome. He refuses to let the blessing become your idol. So he waits until you desire him above the answer. Does that make sense to you? Can you see the love in that? Waiting also protects you. Sometimes, what you are asking for would harm you if God gave it too early. Sometimes, the door that looks like a blessing would destroy your peace if it opened before time. Sometimes the relationship you begged God to save was actually the very thing he was rescuing you from. Waiting is not God ignoring you. Waiting is God shielding you. I know the process hurts. I know it feels slow. I know there are nights when you wonder if God remembers you at all. But the God who guided you this far has not brought you into the waiting to leave you there. He is shaping your heart, deepening your roots, maturing your spirit. And when he finally speaks, when the silence breaks, when the waiting ends, you will not just receive an answer. You will have become someone stronger, wiser, steadier, more surrendered, and more like him. So let me ask you from soul to soul, will you trust him in the wait? Will you stay even when it's silent? Will you worship even when you don't understand? Because those who learn to wait with God never come out empty. They come out transformed. When the enemy whispers in the silence, silence can be holy, but it can also be dangerous when we don't understand it. Because when God is quiet, the enemy gets loud. Have you noticed, Iso? When heaven seems still, Darkness tries to fill the space. Thoughts you never invited begin to speak. God doesn't care about you. Your prayer doesn't matter. Nothing will change. You're alone. And little by little, those lies start sounding like truth, especially when you're tired. The enemy knows he cannot destroy what God has planned, so he tries to destroy your hope instead. He wants to make you quit before the answer arrives. He wants to convince you that silence is abandonment, so you'll walk away from the God who never walked away from you. So let me ask you something. How many blessings have died in the silence because someone stopped believing too soon? How many answers were on the brink of breaking through, but the heart surrendered to despair instead of surrendering to God? The enemy enters through the cracks of loneliness, cracks of delay, cracks of exhaustion, cracks of disappointment. He knows that silence can feel like rejection. He knows the waiting can bruise a soul, and he loves to whisper while you're vulnerable, hoping you will accept a lie because your heart is tired of holding on to truth. But listen to me carefully. Not every voice that speaks to you in the silence deserves your attention. Just because a thought appears in your mind does not mean it came from God or from you. Some thoughts are arrows. Some thoughts are traps. Some thoughts are thieves. And the enemy is a thief. He knows Scripture. He knows timing. He knows your wounds. He knows your fears. And he will use all of them to manipulate your heart if you let him. So let me ask you, when the silence gets loud with lies, whose voice are you choosing to believe? Are you feeding the thoughts that break you, or the faith that keeps you standing? Because silence is not neutral. It will either shape you or shatter you, depending on which voice you allow to guide you. The enemy says, God has forgotten you. But God says, even if a mother forgets her child, I will never forget you. The enemy says, you are alone. But God says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The enemy says, your prayer is empty. But God says, your tears are recorded in my book. Do you see the difference? One voice wounds, the other voice heals. One voice accuses, the other restores. One voice suffocates, the other gives breath. This is why silence is a battleground. Not a battleground of circumstances, but a battleground of belief. The enemy doesn't need to destroy your life if he can destroy your confidence in God. Because a believer who stops trusting is a believer who stops expecting, and a believer who stops expecting slowly stops praying. That is the enemy's goal. But today, here, right now, you are reclaiming that ground. You are waking up to the strategy of darkness. You are beginning to see that the real fight in the silence has never been about God's presence. It has always been about your perception. God has been there the whole time. And the enemy knows it. That's why he has been working so hard to blind you to it. The silence is not evidence that God is absent. It is evidence that the enemy is afraid of who you will become when you endure this process and hear God again. Realigning the heart in the quiet. There comes a moment in the silence when your heart is forced to decide what it truly believes. Not what it feels, not what it wants, not what it fears, but what it actually believes about God. Have you noticed how silence confronts your foundation? It asks questions no noise ever asks. Do you trust me when I'm not speaking? Do you love me when I'm not answering? Will you stay even when you don't understand? These questions are not cruelty. They are invitations, deep, holy invitations to realign your heart with truth instead of emotion. Because emotions fluctuate, thoughts wander, feelings lie, but truth remains steady. And in the silence, God begins to reveal where your heart has leaned too hard on feelings and not enough on faith. You start to notice how quickly discouragement enters, how easily fear takes over, how fast doubt becomes your companion. And it's not to shame you, but to show you what needs healing. Let me ask you, how much of your faith was built on control? How much of your peace depended on getting answers quickly? How much of your confidence in God depended on visible results? Silence exposes these hidden dependencies, not to break you, but to free you. Because a faith dependent on answers is fragile, but a faith rooted in trust is unbreakable. This is where the heart begins to realign. Slowly, quietly, deeply. You start shifting from, God, answer me now, to God, shape me now. From Lord, explain, to Lord, sustain. From why aren't you speaking to what are you forming in me through this? Do you feel the difference? One posture resists the silence, the other learns from it. Realignment is not instant. It's a daily surrender. Some days you will feel strong. Other days you will barely have a whisper left. But every time you choose to trust, even trembling, you realign a little more. Every time you silence the lie and cling to truth, you realign a little more. Every time you say, God, I don't understand, but I'm not letting go, you realign a little more. And here is the beauty. God honors even the smallest realignment. He sees every internal yes, even the quiet ones. He sees every defeated night you choose to pray anyway. He sees every tear you wipe before anyone notices. He sees you fighting to keep your faith alive, not for applause, not for validation, but because deep down, you still believe He is good. Let me ask you something personal. When was the last time you rested your heart in God instead of wrestling it through exhaustion? Because silence isn't always a battlefield. Sometimes it is a hospital, a place where God lays you down to heal your motives, your wounds, your expectations, your trust. Realignment is simply the soul learning to breathe again in God's rhythm, not its own. So if you are in that quiet place right now, let your heart realign instead of resist. Let God rebuild what fear damaged. Let Him reorder what disappointment scattered. Let Him straighten what doubt bent. Because the silence that once felt like a threat is becoming an altar where your heart is being shaped into something stronger, steadier, and surrendered. When you realize you were never alone, there comes a day, often quietly, without fanfare, when something shifts inside you. Not because the circumstances changed, not because the answer finally came, but because your eyes begin to open. You start to look back and notice moments you didn't value before. Small details, gentle protections, silent rescues, unexpected strength you can't explain, and suddenly you realize I wasn't alone, not even for a moment. Have you ever felt that awakening? That moment when God connects the dots of your past and shows you that even in the silence, He was moving in ways you could not see. When your heart was breaking, He was holding you. When you thought you were abandoned, He was carrying you. When you had no words left to pray, He was interceding for you. When you didn't know which direction to take, He was guiding your steps through closed doors as much as through open ones. But you didn't notice then because pain narrows vision. Silence narrows perspective. All you could see was what wasn't happening. All you could hear was what wasn't being said. But now, slowly, your spirit begins to see the fingerprints of God all over your story. Let me ask you something. How many times did something just happen at the exact moment you needed it most? How many times did you fall apart in private, but still somehow wake up with strength the next morning? How many times did a situation look impossible, yet a way was made? You called it coincidence. You called it luck. You called it timing. But heaven called it love. You see, silence is not the absence of God. Silence is the backdrop where His hidden work becomes most profound. When you don't feel Him, you start to depend on Him. When you don't hear Him, you start to seek Him. When you don't understand Him, you start to trust Him. And trust is the very thing God has been building in you all along. There is something powerful about reaching the place where you stop saying, God, where are you? And start saying, God, I know you're here. Nothing around you changes in that moment, but everything inside you does. Peace enters. Fear weakens. Panic loses its grip. Doubt begins to die. Because once you recognize that God has been with you in every step of the silence loses its power to torment you. And here is a truth that begins to settle into your soul. God's love is not proven by how loudly He speaks, but by how faithfully He stays. People leave when things get quiet. People disappear when pain becomes inconvenient. But God remains. He stays through tears, through questions, through confusion, through waiting. He stays when you're strong and when you fall apart. He stays when you're full of faith and when you're drowning in doubt. He stays when your prayer is a whisper and when your silence is your only prayer. So let me ask you one final question in this chapter. If God never left you in your worst moments, why are you afraid He will leave you now? The silence may have lasted long. The waiting may have been heavy. But step by step your heart is awakening to the truth. You were never alone. Not for one heartbeat. Not for one prayer. Not for one tear. When God begins to speak again, there comes a moment, strong, quiet, unmistakable, when God breaks the silence. Not always with a shout, not always with a miracle. Sometimes it happens through a scripture you've read 1,000 times, but suddenly it breathes differently. Sometimes it comes in a moment of stillness, when a peace you cannot explain settles over your heart. Other times it's a sentence in a message, a worship song, a memory, a whisper inside your spirit that you just know didn't come from you. And in that moment, heaven reminds you, I never stopped speaking. I was teaching you to listen. Have you ever noticed that the voice of God is clearer after a season of silence? When life is loud, you hear many voices, opinions, fears, impulses, distractions. But when God allows silence, those voices lose their power and your soul becomes tuned to a different frequency. So when He finally speaks again, even softly, you recognize His voice instantly, not because it's loud, but because it carries truth. It carries love. It carries peace. It carries Him. Let me ask you, how many times did you think God was silent when in reality you were simply listening to everything else? How many nights did you beg for an answer when the answer was already in the word you kept overlooking? How many times did you feel abandoned while God was simply waiting for your heart to become still enough to hear Him clearly? Silence teaches us to stop treating God like a vending machine and start treating Him like a father. Because a father's voice becomes more meaningful when it is not competing with noise. Silence teaches you to value what He says, so that when He finally speaks, you don't dismiss it. You don't rush past it. You don't doubt it. Instead, you receive it. You honor it. You obey it. And when God begins to speak again, something beautiful happens inside you. Hope returns, not as an emotion, but as an anchor. Peace returns, not as a concept, but as oxygen. Faith rises, not as excitement, but as foundation. The same silence that once felt like a prison becomes the very place where God revives your soul. But here is something many people don't realize. God's voice in the new season often doesn't answer the old questions. Instead of explaining the silence, He reveals Himself in it. Instead of giving you the why, He gives you the who He is, who He has always been, who He will continue to be. Because what your soul needed most was not information. It was revelation, not clarity, but presence, not an explanation, but transformation. So let me ask you now, from spirit to spirit, what is God whispering to you in this moment? What truth is He reviving? What promise is He restoring? What part of your heart is He touching again? Something tells me you can feel it. The stirring, the warmth, the reassurance that God is speaking again. The silence is ending. The voice of the shepherd is calling his child back to peace. What once felt empty now feels sacred. What once felt abandoned now feels embraced. What once felt like silence now feels like guidance. Because when God speaks again, the soul remembers its song. When love becomes the answer. There comes a moment when you finally understand that God's goal was never just to answer your prayer, but to heal your heart. Because what good is an answered prayer if the soul remains wounded, afraid, insecure, or fragile inside? Sometimes we think we need a solution, when what we truly need is restoration. We think we need a miracle, when what we truly need is identity. We beg for change around us when what God wants is transformation within us. And suddenly, it hits you. This whole time, God wasn't ignoring me. He was loving me in a deeper way than I understood. Let me ask you something. How many times in your life did you run to God only because of pain, only because of fear, only because you wanted something? We've all done this, but God loves you too much to reduce your relationship with Him to requests, emergencies, and expectations. He wants to be more than a resource. He wants to be your Father, your refuge, your home, your peace. So sometimes, yes, He allows silence to shift the foundation of your faith from God, answer me, to God, hold me. And that is where everything begins to change. Because when love becomes the answer, you stop praying from panic and start praying from trust. You stop begging and start resting. You stop treating God like the last resort and start treating Him like the constant presence He has always been. You stop asking, God, why aren't you speaking? And begin to say, Lord, I'm listening. Speak when you want. Lead how you want. I'm yours. Do you feel how different that posture is? One is fueled by fear. The other is fueled by love. The silence was never about rejection. It was about redirection. It was God guiding you away from dependence on outcomes and back into dependence on His heart. Because when you love God for who He is, not for what He gives, the enemy loses his power over you. Disappointment loses power. Delay loses power. Doubt loses power. You become unshakable, not because life got easier, but because love became your foundation. This is why the enemy fought you so hard in the silence. He wasn't afraid of your prayer. He was afraid of what your prayer would become once it was purified by love. A believer who prays from fear is unstable, but a believer who prays from love is unstoppable. A believer who prays for answers can be discouraged, but a believer who prays from identity cannot be shaken. Do you see now why the silence mattered? Why it lasted? Why it shaped you? The silence brought you here, to this place of surrender, maturity, and awakening. Not a shallow faith built on quick responses, but a deep faith anchored in love. God didn't just want to give you an answer. He wanted to give you Himself, His presence, His peace, His love. And when love becomes the answer, everything else finally makes sense. Purpose in the silence. There comes a moment after all the wrestling, questioning, and waiting, when your heart finally asks a different question. Not, why is God silent? But what is God building through this silence? And that shift in perspective changes everything. Because purpose gives meaning to pain. Purpose gives endurance to waiting. Purpose gives structure to faith. When the heart understands there is purpose, it stops collapsing and starts standing. Have you noticed how suffering feels heavier when it seems random, unfair, or meaningless? But when you understand that God is intentional, even in what He allows, hope returns to the soul. So let me ask you, what if this silence was never working against you, but always working for you? What if it was preparing you, not punishing you? What if it was training your spirit to recognize God's voice, not doubt His heart? The silence taught you to separate God's presence from your feelings. It taught you to depend on His character, not His volume. It taught you to listen with your spirit, not your anxiety. It taught you to stand even when you didn't understand. And now, looking back, can you see it? Can you see how the silence matured you? How it humbled you? How it deepened you? How it grew you in ways comfort never could? Purpose turns silence into strategy. It turns confusion into preparation. It turns tears into seeds. And God, as a Father, always works with purpose. He wastes nothing, not even silence. He used it to confront your fears, to realign your faith, to remove what was hindering you, and to rebuild you from the inside out. Because before God changes a situation, He changes the person who will walk through it. Let me ask you something deeply honest. If God had answered you exactly when you asked, would you have been spiritually ready for what came after? If He had opened that door sooner, would it have protected you or destroyed you? If He had removed the silence too early, would you have learned to stand, or would you still be depending on instant reassurance to survive? When purpose enters the silence, gratitude begins to grow where frustration once lived. You start thanking God not just for what He gave, but for what He withheld. Not just for what He spoke, but for what He didn't allow. Not just for what He opened, but for what He closed. Because now you see His hand, not just in the blessings, but in the restraint. Nothing about your journey has been wasted, nothing, not one prayer, not one tear, not one waiting season, not one sleepless night, not one moment of silence. God used it all, and He is still using it. You are standing here stronger than before, more rooted than before, more aware than before, more His than before. The silence had a purpose, and now your spirit knows it. Strength rising from the quiet. There comes a moment in the journey, quiet but undeniable, when your soul begins to breathe differently. The weight that once pressed against your chest starts to lift. Hope, once fragile and trembling, begins to stand again. Not because everything around you has changed, but because you have changed inside the silence. For the first time in a long time, you feel something rising within you. Strength, clarity, peace. Have you felt this before? That subtle but sacred shift when your spirit whispers, "I'm not the same person who entered this valley." The silence that once tormented you has now forged you. You no longer pray from fear, but from faith. You no longer seek God for answers alone, but for presence. You no longer ask, "Lord, are you here?" Because you now know He never left. And when you pray, your words sound different, not desperate, but surrendered. Not anxious, but trusting. Not empty, but full of meaning. The silence didn't steal your voice. It refined it. Let me ask you, have you noticed how peace feels deeper after a storm? How joy feels purer after tears? How faith feels stronger after doubt? This is what God was doing all along. He wasn't just preparing a blessing for you. He was preparing you for the blessing. Now what used to break you no longer does. What used to shake you now only sends you back to God instead of away from Him. What used to confuse you now drives you into worship instead of worry. That is transformation. That is maturity. That is spiritual growth. And something powerful happens when you reach this place. The enemy loses his leverage. The silence no longer scares you. The waiting no longer weakens you. Doubt no longer owns you. Why? Because you have discovered God in the quiet. You no longer fear seasons without answers, because you have learned to rest in the One who is the answer. You no longer panic when heaven is still, because you trust the heart of the Father more than the volume of His voice. Let me ask you something personal. What is God restoring in you right now? Your confidence, your identity, your peace, your trust? Can you sense it? The strength that comes not from striving, but from surrender. The kind of strength that doesn't shout but stands, that doesn't rush but rests, that doesn't beg but believes. This is the strength of someone who has passed through silence and come out with deeper roots. It is the strength of someone who has discovered that God is not just the God of miracles, but the God of the process. Not just the God of answers, but the God of formation. Not just the God who speaks, but the God who stays. And as this strength rises in you, one thing becomes clear. The silence was not your end. It was your shaping. It was the ground where God rebuilt you, piece by piece, breath by breath, prayer by prayer. You are no longer the same. You are steadier now, wiser now, closer now, and more aligned with God's heart than ever before. Your spirit is standing again, and this time, it stands on rock. The silence was love all along. There comes a moment, holy, unmistakable, unforgettable, When the soul finally understands what the mind never could. God was loving me, even in the silence. Not loving you less. Not loving you later. Not loving you after the answer. But loving you through the silence. Loving you with the silence. Loving you in spite of the silence. And when this truth finally reaches your heart, something breaks. Not in a painful way, but in a freeing way. A weight lifts, a fear dissolves, and peace takes its place. Have you felt this before? That deep knowing that surpasses explanation, when God doesn't just touch your situation, He touches your soul. Looking back, you can see it now. He was holding you when you thought you were forgotten. He was protecting you when you thought you were ignored. He was working in hidden places when you assumed nothing was happening. He was preparing your heart for what you couldn't see yet. And though you cried, though you questioned, though you trembled, though you almost gave up, God never pulled His hand away, not once, not ever. Let me ask you something. Would you be the person you are today if God had spoken earlier? If He had removed the waiting too soon? If He had interrupted the silence before its work was done? You might have had the answer you wanted, but not the strength you needed. The door you asked for, but not the discernment to walk through it. The blessing you prayed for, but not the roots to sustain it. Silence wasn't God withholding love, it was God deepening it. Now your heart knows what it could not have learned any other way. That God's presence is not proven by noise. His faithfulness is not proven by speed. His love is not proven by immediate answers. He is God in the whisper. He is God in the stillness. He is God in the dark. He is God in the waiting. He is God in the questions. And because of that, you are no longer shaken by silence. You no longer fear it. You no longer misinterpret it. Silence has lost its power to torment you, because now you see the purpose behind it. Let me ask you one final question. Now that you know God was loving you in the silence, what do you fear? What can shake you now? What storm can steal your peace? What delay can destroy your faith? What lie can make you doubt again? Nothing. Because when the soul discovers that God is love, not just in answers but in silence, faith becomes unbreakable. You are not the same person who began this journey. You pray differently now. You trust differently now. You see God differently now. And above all, you see yourself differently now. Not forgotten but chosen. Not abandoned but held. Not unheard but deeply loved. The silence didn't win. God did. And so did you. Prayer, Lord, here's the heart that is waited, the soul that is questioned, the voice that is prayed in silence. Here is every tear, every night, every doubt, every whisper that no one else heard. Today, Father, I ask you to do what no words can do. Breathe life again into this heart. Heal what the silence exposed. Restore what fear tried to break. Strengthen what waiting has tired. Wrap this soul in your love. Let your presence be felt in the quiet places, the hidden places, the wounded places. Where there was fear, give peace. Where there was confusion, give clarity. Where there was exhaustion, give rest. And where faith trembled, make it stand again, not by sight, not by signs, but by the certainty of who you are. Teach us to trust your timing, to rest in your heart, to listen for your whisper, and to walk with you, even when we do not understand the path. We surrender the need for control. We surrender the need for answers. We choose to believe that your silence is not abandonment. It is love, shaping us from the inside out. Hold us, guide us, and speak to us according to your will. We are yours, and we trust you. In Jesus' name, amen. Isaiah 41:10, NIV. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. You were never praying into emptiness. He was in the silence. He was in the waiting. He was in every breath between your words, and now you know. Rest. Your heart is held. Your future is safe. And His love has always been the answer.